A dangerous alliance. As the weeks passed, Claire's heartache deepened, but so did her resolve to uncover the truth about Nate's disappearance. The authorities had quickly written off the incident as a tragic accident, citing the risks of duck hunting in the murky waters of Lake Oak. Yet Claire couldn't bring herself to accept that conclusion. Nate was careful. He was a seasoned hunter who knew the dangers of the lake better than anyone. She had gone over the details of that day in her mind 1,000 times, but none of it made sense. She began to notice the small, unsettling changes in her life. The people around her seemed to be moving on, but Claire felt as though she was stuck, caught in a moment of time that wouldn't let her go. Friends and family offered their condolences, but their words felt hollow. They didn't understand the gnawing feeling that consumed her, that something was horribly wrong, something far more sinister than a simple accident. It wasn't just the unanswered questions about Nate's disappearance that troubled her. It was also the strange behavior of her husband's best friend, Eric. Eric had always been close to Nate, their bond forged over years of hunting trips, late-night talks, and shared secrets. The two had been inseparable since childhood, but since Nate's death, Eric's presence in Claire's life had taken on a new, almost uncomfortable quality. At first, Eric was a constant support for Claire. He had been there when Nate first went missing, helping her search the lake and offering reassurances when the police grew less optimistic. He would come over for dinners, keep her company during the long, lonely nights, and even help with Jack when Claire had to run errands. His comforting presence should have brought Claire peace, but instead, it made her uneasy. There was an intensity to his gaze, a sharpness in his words, that she hadn't noticed before. It was as if Eric was no longer just her late husband's best friend, but something more, someone who was trying to insert himself into her life in ways that didn't feel natural. But it wasn't until Claire began to review some of Nate's personal papers, insurance documents, emails, financial statements, that the true extent of the betrayal became clear. She had found the life insurance policy, the large one, the one she had never known about, taken out shortly before Nate's death. The policy, valued at $1.5 million, named Claire as the beneficiary, and that wasn't the most disturbing part. The more she looked into it, the more she realized that Eric had been the one to handle the details. He had been the one who arranged the policy, signed the documents, and made sure everything was in place. Claire felt the ground shift beneath her. She had known about the smaller policies, the ones Nate had set up years ago to ensure Claire and Jack would be taken care of in case something happened to him. But this new policy had come out of nowhere. And the timing of it, just months before Nate's death, felt too suspicious to ignore. It was almost as if Nate had known something was going to happen, as if he had sensed a threat, not from nature, but from someone far closer to him. With a sinking heart, Claire realized that Eric had been involved in this decision. He had been the one to broker the policy. And now, as the sole beneficiary, Claire stood to inherit a fortune. But was it worth it? Was the money worth the life of the man she had loved for so many years? Over the following days, Claire's mind raced. Could it be possible? Could Eric, her late husband's best friend, have betrayed him in such a monstrous way? Was there something more to Nate's death than just a tragic accident? She had to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. She confronted Eric one evening, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and determination. She needed answers. The gnawing feeling in her gut was unbearable. She couldn't go on like this, pretending everything was normal while something dark lurked beneath the surface. Eric had been sitting on the couch, a beer in hand, when Claire walked in. His demeanor was as calm and collected as always, but there was something in his eyes, something that Claire had never noticed before. His gaze was cold, calculating. "Eric," Claire began, her voice wavering at first, but then gaining strength as she spoke. "I need to know what happened. What really happened to Nate?" Eric looked up from his drink, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone casual, almost too casual. Claire swallowed hard, gathering her courage. I found the life insurance papers, Eric. The ones for the policy Nate took out just before he died. You handled everything, didn't you? A flicker of unease crossed Eric's face, but he quickly masked it with a forced smile. Claire, you know how much Nate trusted me. He wanted to make sure you and Jack were taken care of if anything ever happened to him. That's all. But Claire wasn't fooled. She could see the subtle shift in his posture, the tightening of his jaw. He was nervous, and that was enough for her to know that something wasn't right. That's not all, Eric, she pressed. The timing of it, the amount, it's too much. You were involved in every step of this, weren't you? I need to know, Eric, did you have something to do with Nate's death? For a moment, Eric didn't speak. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Then, slowly, he set the beer down on the table, his eyes meeting Claire's. Claire, you have no idea what you're asking, Eric said softly, his voice tinged with something that sounded almost like pity. You don't understand. I want to understand, Claire said, her heart pounding in her chest. I want the truth. Eric took a deep breath, his gaze flicking away for a moment, as if contemplating how to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, but it carried a weight that Claire could feel deep in her bones. I didn't want it to go down like this. But the truth is, Claire, I loved you long before Nate ever did. Claire's blood ran cold at his words. She had always considered Eric family, almost like a brother to her. The thought that he had harbored such feelings, let alone acted on them, was a betrayal too deep to comprehend. What are you talking about? Claire whispered, feeling the walls of her world crumble. Eric's eyes were filled with an emotion that Claire couldn't quite place, a mix of sadness and something darker, something possessive. I've always been in love with you, Claire. I know you never saw it, but I've been here, all along, waiting, watching. And when Nate died, it was my chance to finally have you. I thought, maybe, just maybe, I could have everything I wanted. The house, the family, the life. Claire took a step back, her heart racing in her chest. The realization hit her like a slap to the face. Eric hadn't just betrayed Nate for money. He had done it for her. He had manipulated her grief, waiting for her to be vulnerable, for a crack to form in her life where he could slip in and take everything she had. And when he did, he wouldn't just have her, he would have Nate's legacy. I never meant for it to go this far, Eric continued, his voice tinged with regret. But when Nate disappeared, I thought it was fate. It was my opportunity to step in, to be the man you needed. But I never expected you to find out. I never wanted it to end like this. Claire felt sick to her stomach, her body trembling with disbelief and fury. You killed him, she whispered, the words barely making it past her lips. You killed Nate. Eric's face twisted in something that might have been guilt, but it was quickly masked by coldness. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. I didn't mean to. But Claire couldn't hear him anymore. Her mind was reeling, and she felt the room spin around her. Everything she had known, everything she had trusted, had been a lie. Eric had orchestrated Nate's death for his own gain, manipulating the situation with the skill of a man who had been plotting for years. And now, the truth was out. But the story wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Claire knew she had to go to the police. She had to make sure that Eric paid for what he had done. And she had to find out who else was involved. Because as she stood there in the room, the weight of the truth pressing down on her, she realized that Nate's death was part of something much bigger than a simple act of betrayal. It was a carefully crafted conspiracy, one that had been years in the making, and the people behind it were still out there, hiding in plain sight. A dangerous alliance continued. As Claire stood in the dimly lit living room, the full scope of Eric's betrayal began to sink in. The words he had spoken felt like poison, each syllable twisting deeper into her heart. But it wasn't just the admission of his love for her that shattered her. It was the realization that her life had been manipulated from the inside out, by the very man she had trusted most. Eric's confession was the starting point of a spiral Claire hadn't anticipated. She had thought the worst of her grief had already passed. The overwhelming sorrow of losing Nate, the confusion, the lonely nights spent crying into her pillow. But now she was confronted with something far darker. Eric hadn't just taken advantage of her vulnerability. He had orchestrated her husband's death with meticulous planning, as if everything had been part of a grand design. A scheme to not only inherit Nate's life, but to step into his place as the man of the house, as the father of her son. But why? Why had Eric gone this far? What was it about their relationship that had driven him to such extreme lengths? She couldn't comprehend it. Eric had always been a presence in her life, like family. He had been there through the ups and downs, never once giving her reason to suspect his intentions. Even as a child, his bond with Nate had been unshakable. The thought that this bond could have hidden such dark motivations left Claire numb. It was at that moment that she realized that everything she thought she knew about her life, her marriage, her friendship with Eric, her trust in those around her, was a facade. A lie, a carefully constructed web of deceit. Eric's voice broke through her thoughts. He hadn't left. He hadn't walked away. He was still standing there, his presence looming over her like a dark cloud. "Claire, please," he said, his tone a mix of pleading and resignation. "I never wanted you to find out this way. I never wanted to hurt you. But I've been in love with you for years. I couldn't keep living this lie. I wanted us to be together. I thought if I helped you after Nate's disappearance, if I was there for you, it would make everything right. I never imagined it would all fall apart like this." Claire took a deep breath, steadying herself, fighting the whirlwind of emotions threatening to overtake her. She had to stay calm, no matter how badly she wanted to scream. The truth was too shocking, too painful, and it was too much to process all at once. But she had no choice. She needed answers, and this was the only way to get them. "You killed Nate," Claire said, her voice steady despite the surge of anger and disbelief rising within her. "You killed my husband for what? For me? For money? For power?" Eric looked away, his hands trembling slightly. "I didn't kill him because I wanted power, Claire. I did it because I couldn't stand the idea of losing you. I thought if Nate was gone, we could have a life together. I'd help you raise Jack. I'd give you everything you ever wanted. We could be happy, Claire. We could start over." Claire felt her stomach twist. She could feel her chest tightening with a mixture of disgust and betrayal that threatened to suffocate her. "You took away everything from me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You took away Nate's life. You took away my future. You." Her breath hitched, the tears she had been holding back threatening to spill over. "How could you do this to us, Eric? How could you take away my husband just to get me?" Eric shifted uncomfortably, his face flushing. He took a step toward Claire, as if trying to reach out to her, but she recoiled instinctively. "I never meant for it to be like this. I thought I could make it better. I thought that by being there for you, being the one you leaned on, you'd come to see that I was the right man for you." He paused, his voice quiet now, almost apologetic. "I was always second place to Nate. I wanted to be the man you needed, the man Jack needed. And when Nate started getting distant, I saw my chance. It wasn't supposed to go as far as it did, Claire." Claire's mind was racing. What was he talking about? Nate distant? Claire could remember the last few months before Nate's disappearance, long hours at work, a few tense moments, but nothing that would explain what Eric was claiming. Her mind whirred as the pieces of the puzzle started falling into place. Could Nate have suspected something? Could he have sensed Eric's intentions? The life insurance policy, the sudden shift in Eric's behavior, the pressure from Eric to help her after Nate's disappearance. It all seemed too calculated, too carefully planned. Nate had always been intuitive, sharp even when he didn't want to be. Could he have discovered Eric's betrayal just before the hunt? Could that be the real reason why he hadn't returned home when expected? Had he realized that the man he trusted with his life had been plotting his death all along? Claire's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She froze, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. The last thing she needed was more people in the house. But as the door creaked open, she saw who it was. Jack, their young son, standing in the doorway with his big brown eyes, his face innocent and trusting. "Mom," Jack asked, his voice small. "Is everything okay?" Claire's heart shattered at the sight of her son. He was too young to understand what was happening, too young to grasp the full extent of the betrayal that was unfolding in their home. Her mind raced, and for the briefest moment, Claire felt completely lost. She had to protect Jack. She had to shield him from the horrors she was now facing. Before she could respond, Eric stepped forward, his voice strained. "Jack, buddy, come here." His voice was softer now, almost a whisper, but Claire could hear the subtle attempt to reclaim control in the way he said her son's name. But Claire wasn't having it. "No, Eric," she snapped, her voice sharp. She turned to her son, forcing a smile despite the chaos in her mind. "It's okay, Jack. Everything's fine. Sweetheart." Jack looked between the two of them, confusion clouding his young face. Claire stepped forward, kneeling to bring herself down to his level, trying to offer comfort despite the storm brewing inside her. "Mommy and Eric were just talking, honey. Go to your room for a while, okay? We'll talk soon." Jack hesitated for a moment, sensing something was off, but then he nodded and slowly walked away. As the sound of his little footsteps faded down the hallway, Claire's thoughts turned back to Eric. The quiet tension in the room was palpable, thickening as Claire began to feel the weight of her choices pressing down on her. The man she had once considered a close friend was the very person who had orchestrated her husband's murder. The man who had been there through her darkest moments was the one who had taken away her future. But Claire knew, deep down, she couldn't let him destroy everything. For herself, for Jack, and for Nate, she needed to stop Eric. She needed to expose him for who he really was. "I'm going to the police," Claire said, her voice firm and resolute. "I have to. I can't let you get away with this, Eric. I won't let you." Eric's face twisted with panic. "You don't understand, Claire. If you go to the police, everything is over. You'll lose everything. Your reputation, your son. You'll never be able to move on. Think about what you're doing." But Claire had already made up her mind. "It's over, Eric. It was over the moment you decided to betray Nate. I'm done listening to your lies." With that, she turned and walked toward the door, her heart pounding with the realization that her life was about to change forever. The weight of what she was about to do settled in her chest, but there was no turning back. Eric had taken everything from her, and now it was time for him to face the consequences. As she opened the door to leave, she felt a chill run down her spine. The battle had only just begun, but Claire was ready to fight. For herself, for Jack, for Nate. A web of lies. The days following Claire's confrontation with Eric were a blur of emotion and uncertainty. As she walked away from her home, her heart heavy with the knowledge of Eric's betrayal, she knew there was no going back. The house that had once been a sanctuary for her family now felt like a prison, its walls closing in with every step she took. The life she had carefully built with Nate seemed to unravel with each passing moment, and Claire couldn't help but wonder if any of it had ever been real. Had their love been true? Had their friendship with Eric been genuine? Or had it all been part of a plan, one that she had been too blind to see? It was late in the afternoon when Claire finally reached the police station. Her hands trembled as she stepped through the doors, her mind racing with the words she needed to say. The overwhelming weight of everything she had just learned threatened to crush her, but she pushed forward. She had come here for a reason, and she couldn't afford to back down now. The receptionist at the front desk gave her a sympathetic look as Claire explained the situation, and soon she was escorted to a small, sterile room at the back of the station. Claire took a seat, her mind clouded with doubt. Was she doing the right thing? Was there enough evidence to make a case against Eric? Her thoughts kept circling back to Nate and the life he had lost, the life they had all lost. But Claire knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let Eric get away with it. Detective Marlowe, a seasoned investigator with years of experience in dealing with complicated cases, entered the room a few minutes later. She was in her late 40s, her face lined with the marks of time spent chasing after truth, but there was a kindness in her eyes that put Claire at ease. She could tell from the moment they exchanged greetings that Detective Marlowe was someone who understood what it meant to fight for justice. Claire knew this was where her fight would begin. "Claire, I'm glad you came in," Detective Marlowe said gently, sitting across from her. "I can only imagine what you're going through. But I need you to tell me everything you know, everything that's led you here today." Claire took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had thought about this moment over and over again, but now that it was here, she felt unprepared. Still, she had to do this. For Nate, for Jack, for herself. "It's about Eric," Claire said quietly, her voice almost breaking. I don't know how to explain this, but I think he had something to do with Nate's death. I think he killed him." She paused, the weight of her words sinking in. "I didn't want to believe it at first, but I found something. I found a life insurance policy that Nate took out, one that Eric helped arrange. It's worth $1.5 million, and it was taken out just before Nate went missing. And then there's the way Eric's been acting. It's all been too much to ignore." Detective Marlowe nodded, her expression serious but not judgmental. "I understand, Claire, but you need to realize something. Accusations like this are serious. I'm going to need proof. I need facts, evidence that can help us build a case." "I know," Claire whispered, the realization that this would be a long, uphill battle sinking in. "But I can't just sit by and do nothing. I need to know what happened to Nate." Detective Marlowe placed her hand on the table, her fingers tapping lightly in thought. "What else do you know about Eric's involvement? Did he have any history of being violent or manipulative?" Claire hesitated, thinking back to the years she had known Eric. He had always been supportive, always present when they needed him. But now, with the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, Claire could see things she had been blind to before. "Eric has always been close to Nate," Claire began, "but there were things I never noticed. Over the past year, Nate had started getting more distant, maybe because of work, maybe because of our family life. I didn't see the changes until after Nate disappeared. But Eric seemed to be around a lot more, almost too much. I thought it was just him being a good friend, but now I think he was using that time to position himself." Detective Marlowe sat back in her chair, making notes in her notepad. "Do you think Eric acted alone, or could someone else have been involved?" Claire's stomach churned as she considered the possibility. Was Eric truly acting alone, or was there a larger conspiracy at play? She didn't have enough answers yet to make that call, but she was sure of one thing. Eric was at the center of it all. "I think Eric acted alone," Claire said after a long pause. "But I'm not sure. She was interrupted by a knock at the door. A uniformed officer stepped inside, holding a folder. "Detective Marlowe, we've got some new information on the case." Claire's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Had they found something that would finally give her the closure she so desperately needed? Marlowe glanced up, nodding for the officer to hand over the file. She opened it quickly, her eyes scanning the contents. "This might be what we've been waiting for," she murmured. Claire leaned forward, her breath catching in her throat. "What is it?" "The boat," Detective Marlowe said, looking up at Claire. "The one Nate was using on the day he disappeared. It was found, not too far from the cove, in an area that was previously searched multiple times. And inside the boat, we found something strange. A pair of gloves, specially made, not something you'd typically find on a hunting trip, and a partial fingerprint that doesn't match Nate's." Claire's mind raced. "Eric's fingerprint," she whispered, already knowing the answer. Marlowe gave a small, grim nod. We're running it through the system now, but it looks like that's exactly what we're dealing with. It's circumstantial, but it's a start. Claire's stomach tightened as she processed the information. Could Eric have been careless enough to leave his fingerprint on the boat, or had it been placed there deliberately to mislead investigators? Either way, it was enough to raise suspicion. Claire wasn't sure how much longer she could keep her composure. But there's more, Marlowe continued, her voice lowering as she leaned in closer. We also found traces of gunpowder residue on the gloves. That's consistent with the theory that Nate was shot, not drowned. Claire's breath hitched. Shot, but I thought it was an accident. The lake, the alligators. She couldn't finish the thought, the horror of it all overwhelming her. Detective Marlowe's eyes were steady. We're not ruling anything out yet, but the evidence we found suggests foul play. The gloves and the fingerprint are just the beginning. There's also something else we need to look into. Eric's financial records. If he's involved in this, we need to know what his motive was. Claire sat back, her mind reeling. She had always known Eric had his issues, but she had never suspected that he was capable of murder. It seemed impossible, yet all the pieces were falling into place, one by one. The detective stood up, signaling that the meeting was coming to an end. Claire, we're going to need your help with this. We'll be looking into Eric's past, his finances, and anything else we can find. I know this is hard, but I need you to keep your head clear. We'll get to the bottom of this. Claire nodded, though her heart felt heavy with the weight of what was to come. The road ahead was uncertain, and the truth, if it ever came, would destroy everything she thought she knew about the people she trusted most. But there was no turning back. She had already taken the first step, and now, with the help of Detective Marlowe, Claire was determined to find out what really happened to Nate, no matter the cost. Because the truth had to come out, and Eric could not be allowed to walk away from the destruction he had caused. The next few days were a blur of interviews, phone calls, and investigations, but Claire couldn't stop thinking about the one question that haunted her. If Eric had killed Nate, who was next? And would she be able to stop him before it was too late? The trial of a lifetime. The arrest of Eric was only the beginning. Though Claire had finally taken the first step in the long and arduous process of seeking justice for Nate, she knew that the battle was far from over. It had been weeks since Detective Marlowe's call, and with each passing day, the truth about what had transpired between Eric and Nate seemed more unbelievable. But Eric's arrest had ignited a firestorm of emotions within Claire. Grief, anger, relief, and fear all swirling together. She was no longer just a widow. She was a woman fighting for the truth and for the life that was taken from her. The trial was set to begin in a few months, and as the date approached, the weight of the proceedings bore heavily on Claire. As much as she wanted to see Eric pay for what he had done, the thought of sitting through a courtroom trial, rehashing every painful detail of Nate's murder, terrified her. The man she had once called a friend, the person she had shared so much of her life with, was now the face of betrayal, and the task of putting him behind bars would be a long and grueling process. But Claire had made a promise to herself that she would never turn away from the truth, no matter how ugly it was. Eric's defense attorneys had already started to build their case. They would argue that there was insufficient evidence to prove premeditated murder. They would try to paint Eric as a victim of circumstances, someone who had made a tragic error in judgment, someone driven to desperate measures by the pressures of debt and a strained relationship. They would attempt to frame the murder as a crime of passion rather than cold-blooded calculation. But Claire knew better. She knew the truth. She knew how carefully Eric had orchestrated every aspect of Nate's death, from the manipulated life insurance policies to the way he had staged the accident. The gloves, the fingerprint, the gunpowder residue, every piece of evidence painted a picture of a man who had planned his best friend's murder with ruthless precision. As the weeks rolled by, Claire found herself questioning every detail of her life with Eric. Had she truly known him? Had she seen the signs of his growing desperation? She had always been so focused on her own life, so wrapped up in her marriage and motherhood that she had failed to notice the cracks forming in her friendship with Eric. The late-night phone calls, the unsolicited advice, the way he seemed to insert himself into every aspect of her life. It had all been part of his plan, part of a long-term strategy to secure his place in her world. The days before the trial were filled with visits from her attorney and long, sleepless nights. Claire's once comfortable home now felt like a place of constant tension, the walls closing in as the reality of the situation pressed in on her. Every time she looked at Jack, her heart ached for the life that had been stolen from them. Nate would never see his son grow up. Jack would never know his father, and Claire would be left to carry the weight of the tragedy alone. When the day of the trial finally arrived, Claire stood at the courthouse steps, flanked by her attorney and a few of her closest friends and family. She had expected the moment to feel like an emotional release, but instead, she was overwhelmed by a sense of dread. She could barely breathe as she stepped inside the building, the tension thick in the air. The courtroom was crowded with reporters, people who had heard about the case but didn't know the true depth of the pain it had caused. Claire took a deep breath and sat down, her hands clenched in her lap. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to back down now. The prosecution began by laying out the timeline of events leading up to Nate's disappearance. They spoke of the phone records, the suspicious activity surrounding the life insurance policies, and the discovery of the gloves with gunpowder residue. The evidence was damning, and it quickly became clear that Eric's story was unraveling. But it wasn't just the evidence that made Claire's stomach turn. It was the way Eric's defense team tried to manipulate the facts. They painted Eric as a man under tremendous pressure, someone pushed to the brink by financial strain and personal failure. They claimed that his actions had been driven by an overwhelming sense of loss, that he had never intended for Nate to die, that it was all just a tragic mistake. But Claire knew better. She watched as Eric sat in the defendant's chair, his face a mask of false remorse. His eyes met hers once, a fleeting moment that sent a shiver down her spine. She saw the same man she had once trusted, the same man who had stood by her side when Nate was alive. But now, all Claire saw was a cold, calculating murderer, a man who had killed for selfish gain, for control, and for the life he thought he deserved. As the trial continued, Claire sat through testimony after testimony, each one revealing more about Eric's deceitful behavior. The prosecution called witnesses who had known Eric for years, people who spoke of his financial troubles, his manipulative nature, and his growing obsession with Claire. The defense attempted to discredit them, but their words held weight. Slowly, the walls of Eric's carefully constructed life began to crumble, piece by piece. Claire could barely stand to look at him, but she forced herself to stay focused. She had to do this for Nate, for Jack, for herself. The most difficult part of the trial was when Claire was called to the stand. Her hands trembled as she took the oath, swearing to tell the truth. As she recounted the events leading up to Nate's disappearance, her voice wavered, but she pushed through the tears. She described the love she had shared with Nate, the life they had built together, and the betrayal she had felt when she uncovered the truth about Eric. She spoke of the overwhelming grief she had experienced, the pain of losing the man she had loved and the father of her child. When Claire finished her testimony, the courtroom was silent. She had done what she came to do. She had told the truth. But as she stepped down from the stand, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She had exposed Eric for the monster he was, but she couldn't help but feel that the justice she sought would never truly heal the wounds inside her. Nate was gone, and no matter how many years Eric spent in prison, it would never bring him back. The trial continued for weeks, with the prosecution building a rock-solid case against Eric. But as the closing arguments approached, Claire began to feel the weight of the past few months catching up to her. She was exhausted, physically, emotionally, and mentally. The toll the trial had taken on her was immense, and every moment she spent in the courtroom was a reminder of everything she had lost. But Claire knew that this was the only chance she had to see Eric punished for what he had done. It was the only way to find closure and begin rebuilding the life she had once dreamed of. The defense gave its closing argument, attempting to convince the jury that Eric had acted out of desperation, that he had never intended to kill Nate, that it was a tragic accident that spiraled out of control. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the prosecution's case was airtight. The jury deliberated for hours, but Claire knew deep in her heart that justice would prevail. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom fell silent. Claire sat in her seat, holding her breath, as the foreman of the jury stood and announced, "Guilty." Eric's face went pale, and for the first time, Claire saw true fear in his eyes. He was no longer the confident, manipulative man he had once been. He was a man who had been exposed, a man who would pay for the destruction he had caused. The jury had spoken, and Eric was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. As Claire left the courtroom, she felt a strange sense of numbness wash over her. It wasn't the relief she had expected. It was more like a bittersweet acknowledgement that nothing would ever be the same again. Eric would be locked away, but Nate would never return. She could never undo the damage that had been done. But for the first time in months, Claire felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but it was hers to walk now, with Jack by her side. And as the sun set on the day of the trial, Claire knew one thing for certain. She had found the strength to face the truth, and in doing so, she had taken the first step toward healing.